For over 5 decades, he stayed quiet. No memoirs, no interviews, no emotional tributes, not even a whisper of what it was like growing up in the towering shadow of one of America's most beloved television stars. While fans around the world mourned the loss of Dan Blocker, the gentle giant who played Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza, his son Dirk was dealing with a grief far more personal and far more painful. He wasn't just saying goodbye to a famous TV character, he was saying goodbye to his father. But while the world remembered Hoss with reruns, fan letters, and tearful tributes, Dirk said nothing, not in public, not on camera, not even in print. He simply disappeared from the public narrative, choosing to carry that pain in silence. And as the years passed, then decades, that silence became heavier, more permanent. Most assumed he'd moved on, buried the memories, or perhaps didn't want to relive them, but they were wrong. Because now, at 67 years old, older than his father ever got to be, Dirk Blocker has broken the silence. In a heartfelt and raw moment that stunned fans across the globe, he's finally opening up about the father he lost, the legacy he inherited, and the lifelong impact of growing up with a name that carried both fame and unbearable sorrow. And what he revealed, no one expected. This isn't just a story about Hollywood, or about fame, or even about Bonanza. This is the story of a son who stayed quiet for 53 years, until now, May 13th, 1972. A day that's etched into the memory of Bonanza fans as the moment they lost their favorite character. But for Dirk Blocker, that date holds a meaning much deeper than any television loss. It was the day his father, Dan Blocker, died unexpectedly during routine gallbladder surgery. Just 43 years old, Dan's death came as a shock to everyone, but especially to his teenage son. At just 14, Dirk found himself standing at a crossroads between public tragedy and private grief. He later admitted that he didn't understand the magnitude of what had happened at the time. He simply knew his father was gone, and suddenly, the world expected him to carry the weight of that loss with quiet dignity. No crying in public, no breakdowns, just a stoic silence that would stretch over 5 decades. "I felt like I had to be strong because everyone else was breaking down," Dirk recently revealed, "but inside, I was completely lost." He didn't just lose a dad, he lost a protector, a mentor, a man who was larger than life in every way. And for years, Dirk buried that loss so deep that even he forgot how much pain he was carrying. Being the child of a beloved celebrity isn't all red carpets and flashing lights. In fact, Dirk remembers feeling invisible at times, overshadowed by his father's towering fame and warm on-screen persona. Dan Blocker wasn't just Hoss Cartwright, he was America's gentle giant. A 6'4" Texan with a heart as big as his frame, Dan played the lovable middle Cartwright brother with humor, compassion, and strength, and fans adored him for it. But at home, Dirk says, it wasn't always easy. "People would come up to my dad constantly, treating him like a saint," he said, "but to me, he was just dad. And suddenly, I had to share him with the world." As the youngest child, Dirk was particularly close to Dan. They shared a love of storytelling, laughter, and long walks around their California home. But after Dan's passing, those memories became a source of confusion. The same fans who sent sympathy cards and flowers were also the ones who expected Dirk to smile, to keep going, to be strong. But being strong didn't come easy when you were a boy trying to grow up without your father, and under the constant gaze of the public eye. Despite being surrounded by the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, Dirk was left to navigate his grief, mostly alone. His mother, Dolphia Lee, did her best to hold the family together, but she was devastated by the loss of her husband, the man she had known since their college days at Sul Ross State University. She had built a life with Dan long before he was Hoss Cartwright, long before the cameras and fame. Now, with 4 children to raise and a household shaken to its core, she grieved quietly, retreating from the public eye while doing everything she could to protect her children from the media frenzy that followed Dan's unexpected passing. His older brother David, who would later become a respected television producer, also withdrew. Though David was in his early 20s at the time of their father's death, he too struggled to make sense of the loss. But no one in the Blocker family was ever really taught how to grieve, not in a world where appearances mattered and silence was seen as strength. Dirk, still a boy, found himself surrounded by adults who were just as heartbroken, but unable to help him process emotions they hadn't even processed themselves. Hollywood, for all its bright lights and heartfelt tributes, wasn't equipped to handle real grief. Within days of Dan Blocker's passing, news outlets had already moved on to the next big story. Executives at NBC issued formal condolences, and fans flooded the network with letters demanding to know how Bonanza would carry on without Hoss. But behind the scenes, there was a frantic scramble, not just to rework scripts, but to determine how to address the gaping absence left by one of the show's most beloved characters. Dirk remembers it all vividly, not the meetings or the headlines, but the strange emotional contradiction. The world was mourning a fictional character while he was mourning his dad. People kept asking, How will Bonanza survive without Hoss? Dirk recalled. And all I could think was, how do I survive without my father? That disconnect only widened the emotional chasm he was falling into. Fans cried for Hoss, but Dirk cried for Dan, and no one seemed to notice the difference. At school, things weren't much easier. Teachers expressed sympathy but kept conversations brief, unsure of how to comfort a child who had lost a parent so publicly. Classmates offered quiet stares, awkward condolences, or worse, nothing at all. Dirk quickly learned that his pain made people uncomfortable. The moment he brought up his father, the room would grow quiet, faces would tense, and so, like many children who grow up in grief, he learned to stop talking, to tuck the memories away, to lock them behind the expectation that the son of a famous man should be strong and resilient. The result was an internalized emotional paralysis. He didn't cry, he didn't ask questions, he didn't even allow himself to feel angry. And while the Bonanza set moved forward, reshaped by Dan's absence and eventually canceled not long after, Dirk remained emotionally stuck, caught between the loss of a father and the public's idea of a legacy. It would be years before he realized just how deeply that silence had scarred him. Choosing to pursue acting wasn't an easy decision for Dirk. Many assumed he was simply following in his father's footsteps, trying to capitalize on the blocker name. But for Dirk, acting wasn't about fame, it was about connection. I wanted to understand my father, he said, and the closest I could get was through his world. Dirk's early roles, including appearances in Baa Black Sheep, Little House on the Prairie, and eventually Brooklyn Nine-Nine, allowed him to carve out a space for himself. But the comparisons never stopped. No matter how different his roles were, he was still Hoss's kid, and that title carried pressure. There were expectations to be gentle, humorous, affable, just like Dan. But Dirk wasn't Dan. He was quieter, more introspective, and less physically imposing. Still, he never resented the connection. I was proud to be his son, he said. I just didn't know how to live my own life without constantly wondering what he would think. Acting gave Dirk a voice, but it couldn't fill the void left by his father. That would take something far deeper, something he wasn't ready to face until recently. So why now? Why after more than 5 decades of silence would Dirk suddenly choose to speak publicly about his father's death? The answer, it turns out, has everything to do with time. I realized that I was older than my father ever got to be, Dirk said, and that hit me like a ton of bricks. At 67, Dirk surpassed his father's lifespan by nearly 25 years. That realization stirred something inside him, a desire to preserve the legacy that was slipping away, not in the public's memory, but in his own heart. He also cited the global pandemic as a turning point. It made me think about what really matters, what stories I hadn't told, what memories I hadn't shared with my children or grandchildren. For the first time, Dirk opened the old family photo albums, pulled out the letters his father had written, and allowed himself to feel the pain and the joy of those lost years. It was both cathartic and overwhelming. I cried more in the last year than I have in the last 40, he admitted, but those tears didn't break him. They healed him. In one of the most emotional moments of his recent interview, Dirk revealed the secret he carried for decades. He blamed himself for not saying goodbye. On the morning of Dan's surgery, Dirk had planned to visit him at the hospital, but school and teenage distractions got in the way. I thought, I'll see him tomorrow, Dirk recalled, but there was no tomorrow. That regret haunted him for years. It shaped his relationships, his choices, and his silence. But through therapy, journaling, and speaking with close friends and family, Dirk has slowly let go of that guilt. I know now that he wouldn't have wanted me to carry that burden, he said. He would have just wanted me to live. And live he has. Dirk has spent the last 30 years married to his wife, Danielle Aubuchon, a woman who has stood by him through the highs and lows of emotional healing. With her support, he's finally found the courage to speak and to honor his father's memory not just as Hoss, but as the man behind the screen. Today, Dirk isn't just a reflection of his father. He's a living continuation of his values. Quietly and without fanfare, Dirk has become involved in several charitable efforts that his father would have cherished. From supporting literacy programs to helping underprivileged youth access the arts, he's channeling his pain into purpose. I want people to remember my dad not just for what he did on TV, but for who he was when the cameras were off, he said. And perhaps even more importantly, Dirk is finally allowing himself to be seen, not as the son of a legend, but as a man who faced unimaginable loss and chose to rise above it. In interviews, he speaks softly, but with conviction. There's no bitterness in his voice, only love, reflection, and a deep desire to ensure that Dan Blocker's story doesn't end with a television show, but lives on in the hearts of those he touched. In the end, Dirk Blocker's story isn't just about grief. It's about love, about a son who carried his pain in silence, only to find that sharing it could set him free, about a legacy that stretches far beyond the borders of a Western television set, and about the healing power of honesty, even if it takes 53 years to arrive. Fans may remember Dan Blocker as Hoss Cartwright, the warm-hearted brother who made them laugh and cry, but thanks to Dirk, They now get to know the man behind the role, a man who loved deeply, gave generously, and left behind a son strong enough to carry his memory into a new generation. And that's something no television script could ever write.